So yes, I got injured, but it's just a very minor injury. As I was doing these RDLs, I felt a tweak in my right hamstring, and so I just put the weight down. And actually, I just continued on with the workout because I knew it was a very minor injury. So today we're talking about how hard do you need to train. First of all, what is hard training? I think this is something that we all know when we see, but how do we define it? How do we quantify it in a quantifiably quantifiable manner? Well, is hard training high volume? Maybe not necessarily. Is it high intensity? High weight on the bar? Not necessarily. Is it high frequency? Just showing up to the gym 26 times per week? Also, not necessarily. I would say hard training is going to be two things. Number one, are you putting a lot of mental effort into your training? And number two, are you taking your sets close to failure? So that's what we're going to talk about today. How close should you train to failure? Should you train to failure? How often should you train to failure? Are there any benefits or drawbacks of training to failure? Are there any safety concerns? And which specific exercises should you or should you not train to failure on? We're also going to look at some of the research. This is a little bit difficult to examine through the scientific research, but we're going to do the best we can based on the research available to answer the question, how hard do you need to train? First of all, we need to realize that the scientific literature does have some limitations when it comes to training to failure. So when it comes to examining volume, for example, it is very easy. Just you get these people and you watch them train and you see how many sets they're doing and then you examine the results. Super easy. Same thing with intensity. You just observe the weight on the bar. Super easy. Same thing with frequency. Just how many times are these dudes showing up to your study? Really very easy to measure and to manage. However, failure is a lot more difficult to measure. Most people train in studies to what is called volitional failure. So this is when you stop doing the set because you wanted to stop doing the set. Especially in untrained individuals, they will stop the set when they get bored, or when they get slightly tired, or when the bar slows down, or when they see a hot girl walk across the gym. Okay? So their variation, their definition of training to failure will be very different from a hardcore athlete. And this makes it very difficult to measure true failure. And yeah, you can see my hamstring sort of tweaking in that bottom position. Probably my fault for programming RDLs after sumo RDLs 2 days ago, but they still don't have a squat rack set up here, so it is what it is. All right, back to failure. So most studies, they use the concept of reps in reserve to measure failure. So reps in reserve is basically how many reps you have left, quote unquote, in the tank. So if you're doing a set and you do 8 reps, but you could have done 10 reps, that is a 2 reps in reserve, a 2 RIR. If you only do 6 reps, that's a 4 RIR. Now this is going to have huge implications on your training, on how much volume you can do, on your recovery, and even on your technique. In general, the closer you are pushing to failure, the less sets that you can do. So just as some general recommendations, just some numbers for you. I know a lot of you are numbers people. I know I am. If you have an RIR 0, and then you also go beyond failure, something like a drop set or slow eccentrics or some other high intensity technique that you can check in my book, I would say 1 to 2 sets per muscle group, per workout. That's really all you can do. So if I do something like a triple drop set on Romanian deadlifts, that's the entire workout for hamstrings. Like there's no other need to do anything else because that's going to take 3 or 4 or maybe even 5 days to recover from, just because that's such a intense load and it really just destroys the muscle so much. So there's really no need to do anything else after that. And I've gotten very good results from doing like 3 sets of hamstrings per week. Now, if you just go to failure, just simple failure, an RIR 0, that is probably going to be 2 to 3, maybe 4 sets that are going to be beneficial. You simply cannot do more before you really suffer the consequences in terms of recovery. When it comes to an RIR 1 or 2, where you're holding back a little bit, you're keeping a couple or 1 or 2 reps in the tank, you can do much more volume, I've found. You can do 4, 5, 6 sets in that fashion because you're not quite going to failure. It is the failure that requires a lot of recovery time. If you're like an RIR 3 or 4, you can probably do 8, 9, 10 sets per muscle group per workout and, recover just fine. When you go into the sort of RIR 5, 6, 7, 8, that's when you can do 10, 15, 20 sets, but maybe that's not as good from a training perspective. If you're like 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 reps in reserve, those sets are basically not going to be very stimulatory, and you might actually get better results from doing less volume but going closer to failure by pushing it harder. So as a general recommendation, I would say you should train 1 to 4 RIR. So you want to keep 1 to 4 reps in the tank for hypertrophy. For strength, you might want to keep a little bit more in the tank. You might want to keep 3 to 4 reps in reserve most of the time. If you look at a lot of powerlifters, they keep quite a few reps in reserve when they train, just because they want to keep fresh, they want to have more frequency in their training to practice the movement, and they don't want a ton of fatigue floating around. They want to keep a high bar speed, good technique, not get injured, and keep progressing with that higher frequency. Are there other considerations for whether you should train to failure? Of course there are. There are many. Let's get into those right now. So the first one is going to be how advanced you are. I would say if you're a beginner, you don't need to train anywhere close to failure in order to get results. Simply put, if you're a beginner, you can be like 5, 6, 7, 8 reps away from failure and still see very good gains, very good progress. This is because you're so sensitive to training. You simply don't need to train that hard to get results. So if I'm writing a plan for a beginner and they're like, I've heard about failure, should I train to failure? I'm just like, no, all right. Train a few reps away from failure, just learn the technique, try to get stronger, try to progressively overload. And actually, a lot of studies, they show that beginners don't gain muscle when they first start training because they get too much muscle damage, often because they're going too close to failure. So I would say beginners, you really want to be conservative with your approach. If you are an intermediate, you've been training for maybe 1 to 4 years, I would say failure becomes more of an option. But again, realize that there is an inverse relationship between failure and volume. Some people do better on failure, other people do better on volume. And in this 1 to 4 years range, this is when you sort of have to discover for yourself, are you someone who thrives from failure or from volume? And this takes some experimentation. If you are an advanced lifter, so you've been lifting, 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 years, this is when failure becomes a little bit tricky. If you're more of a power lifter, obviously you're not going to want to go as close to failure. If you're more of a bodybuilder, this is when failure becomes more of an option. But keep in mind that your recovery capacity, even when you're an elite athlete, if you're natural, it's still finite, okay? So there's still a limited amount of training that you can recover from. You can't just do like 50 sets per week all to failure and expect to make any progress. You're not superhuman. You still have a finite capacity to recover and get better. It is also exercise dependent. So on something like a bench press, if you don't have a spotter, I would never go to true failure. There's really come on, let's be smart. There's really no benefit to ending up with a bar on your chest or your neck or your throat. It's just stupid. Same thing, even if you have a squatter, I don't think bench failure is a good idea, by the way. For squat, again, even if you have a power rack, I don't think going to failure on squats is really going to be a great idea. Again, it's a highly stimulatory exercise already, and you don't need to go to failure to get benefits from squats. It's already such a big exercise that it's just not needed. Something like a leg press, on the other hand, going to failure or maybe 1 to 2 reps shy of failure, I think is a good strategy, just because it's a little bit safer of an exercise. The spine is in a safer position, and it's not as stimulatory. Something like a deadlift, I would never go to failure, just because typically if you go to failure on deadlifts, your back will round at some point. And that is a known mechanism of injury. And it really just takes one deadlift rep, as you just saw, to get yourself injured. And I was lucky to have a very minor injury today, but if you round your back, you can have an injury that messes you up for years and years. So I think on those exercises, it's not really worth going to failure. But on something like a leg extension or most machines, I think failure is actually sort of like the norm. I think you probably should go to failure on most machine exercises to get benefit from them. I would also say that this varies by muscle group. Something like the hamstrings is naturally going to be lower volume compared to something like the rear delts or the side delts. Just due to the innate structure of the muscle, it's very easy to destroy your hamstrings with just one set or two sets, but your rear delts really do better off of more volume. Finally, I want to take a look at a paper that came out a couple of years ago, and this was a paper on trained subjects that compared training to failure and training with a few reps in reserve. And whenever I see a paper on trained subjects, I always want to share that with you guys, because I know it's going to be more relevant to you and to your goals, instead of, a paper on untrained subjects or on the elderly or on people who have never been to a gym. It's just not really that interesting to talk about. So which group got better results? The ones that trained to failure or the ones that didn't? The ones that didn't, the ones that kept a few reps in the tank. So anyone who says you need to train to failure is an idiot and has not read the research. Finally, I just want to emphasize that training is very individual, and to a certain extent, you need to find your own way. Some people can train to failure more often, others cannot. There are so many factors when it comes to deciding this that you really can't just watch a YouTube video and get a straight answer. I wish I could give you a straight answer, but it's going to take a certain amount of self-experimentation to know what to do. Alright, make sure to like the video if you like the video, subscribe to the channel if you like evidence-based videos. That's all for today, and I will see you next time. Stay safe, everyone.